Thomas McKenna wiped the sweat from his weathered forehead as he stood outside the small wooden office in Tucson, Arizona. The year was 1887, and the desert heat was merciless even in the early morning hours. In his calloused hand, he clutched $50, every penny he had managed to save from 3 years of backbreaking work on various cattle ranches across the territory. The money felt both heavy and light at the same time, representing his entire future wrapped in crumpled bills. The land office clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles named Harold Pemberton, looked up from his ledger with barely concealed skepticism. Thomas had walked into the office an hour earlier, his clothes dusty from the trail, his boots worn thin from countless miles of hard ground. Everything about him screamed poverty, yet here he was, inquiring about purchasing land. "You're certain about this property?" Pemberton asked, adjusting his spectacles as he pulled out a faded map. His finger traced along the paper until it stopped at a small section marked in red ink. "This here's the old Morrison place, about 40 miles northeast of here, up in the foothills. Been sitting empty for nigh on 2 years now since old Bill Morrison died. His widow moved back east to live with her sister." Thomas leaned forward, studying the map intently. The property appeared to be roughly 800 acres, with what looked like a creek running through the southern portion. It seemed too good to be true for $50, but Pemberton had assured him that the territory was eager to get settlers on the land, even if it meant selling at rock-bottom prices. "What's the catch?" Thomas asked, his blue eyes narrowing slightly. Years of hard living had taught him that nothing in life came easy, especially not for men like him who had started with nothing and were still fighting to build something meaningful. Pemberton shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his pen tapping nervously against the desk. "Well, it's pretty remote. Nearest neighbor is probably 15 miles away. And..." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "There's been some Apache trouble in that area recently. Nothing too serious, mind you, but the territorial government thought it best to mention it." Thomas had heard the stories about Apache raids, but most of the serious conflicts had ended years ago. He figured the danger was probably exaggerated, used as an excuse to sell land cheap to anyone willing to take the risk. After 3 years of working other men's cattle for barely enough money to eat, the prospect of owning his own ranch, no matter how remote, was worth almost any risk. "I'll take it," he said without hesitation, pulling the $50 from his pocket and spreading the bills across Pemberton's desk. The clerk counted the money twice, then began filling out the necessary paperwork. As he wrote, he continued talking, perhaps feeling guilty about not being entirely forthcoming about the property's history. "Morrison was a good man," Pemberton said, not looking up from his writing. "Built a decent little house up there, dug a well, even started some basic corrals. His cattle operation was small but profitable until the Apache troubles started getting worse. That's when he decided to pull up stakes and move closer to town." Thomas listened carefully, filing away every detail. He had been planning this moment for years, ever since he had first arrived in Arizona territory as a young man of 22 with nothing but the clothes on his back and a determination to make something of himself. Now, at 25, he was finally going to be a landowner. The paperwork took another hour to complete, with Pemberton carefully explaining the boundaries of the property and Thomas's rights and responsibilities as the new owner. When it was finished, Thomas found himself holding a legal deed to 800 acres of Arizona territory land, purchased for less than most men spent on a good horse. He spent the rest of the day in Tucson purchasing supplies. His money was now limited to the few dollars he had kept back for essentials, so every purchase had to be carefully considered. He bought basic tools, some flour and beans, coffee, and a small amount of ammunition for his old Henry rifle. He also purchased a pack mule to help carry his supplies, using nearly the last of his money. The journey to his new property took 2 days of hard riding through increasingly rugged terrain. The landscape gradually changed from desert scrub to rolling hills covered with oak trees and tall grass. It was beautiful country, and Thomas began to understand why Morrison had chosen this particular spot for his ranch. On the afternoon of the second day, he crested a small ridge and saw his new home for the first time. Below him lay a valley perhaps 2 miles long and a mile wide, with a clear creek meandering through its center. Near the creek stood a modest log cabin with a stone chimney, and beyond it were the remains of what had once been a decent set of corrals and outbuildings. Thomas sat on his horse for a long time, just taking it all in. The property was even better than he had dared to hope. The grass in the valley was thick and green, perfect for cattle. The creek would provide year-round water, and the surrounding hills would offer shelter from winter storms. With hard work and a little luck, he could build a successful ranch here. He rode down into the valley as the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the grass. The closer he got to the cabin, the more details he could make out. The building was solidly constructed of pine logs, with a good roof that appeared to be in decent repair. The windows were intact, though he couldn't tell from a distance whether there was any glass in them. As he approached the cabin, Thomas noticed something that made him pull up short. There was smoke rising from the chimney. His hand instinctively moved to the rifle scabbard on his saddle. Someone was living in his cabin, and, given Pemberton's warnings about Apache trouble, he had to assume the worst. He dismounted and tied his horse and pack mule to a scrub oak about 50 yards from the cabin, then checked his rifle to make sure it was loaded. Moving carefully from tree to tree, Thomas worked his way closer to the building. When he was close enough to see clearly through the open door, what he saw inside nearly made him drop his rifle in surprise. 3 women sat around a small fire built in the stone fireplace. They were Apache, that much was obvious from their clothing and the way they wore their long black hair. But they weren't warriors or raiders. They appeared to be going about the simple business of preparing an evening meal, their movements calm and unhurried. The oldest of the 3 looked to be perhaps 40 years old, with streaks of gray in her hair and the weathered face of someone who had lived a hard life. The second appeared younger, maybe 25, with strong features and alert eyes that seemed to miss nothing. The third was clearly the youngest, probably no more than 16, with the uncertain movements of someone just beginning to find her place in the world. Thomas remained hidden behind a large oak tree, trying to decide what to do. These women were living on his land, in his cabin, but they didn't appear to be hostile. In fact, they seemed to be simply trying to survive, just as he was. The ethical implications of the situation began to weigh on him. He had a legal right to the property, but what right did that give him to turn 3 women out into the wilderness? As he watched, the youngest woman emerged from the cabin carrying a wooden bucket. She walked toward the creek, passing within 20 feet of where Thomas was hidden. Up close, he could see that her clothes were worn and patched, and she looked thin, as if food had been scarce for some time. She knelt by the creek to fill her bucket, and, as she did, she suddenly froze. Her head turned slowly toward the oak tree where Thomas was hiding, and their eyes met across the fading light of evening. For a moment, neither of them moved. The girl's dark eyes were wide with surprise and fear, but she didn't scream or run. Instead, she slowly stood up, still holding the bucket, and spoke quietly in Apache. Thomas didn't understand the words, but her tone wasn't aggressive or threatening. Thomas made a decision that would change his life forever. He stepped out from behind the tree, holding his rifle pointed toward the ground in a clear gesture of non-aggression. The girl took a step backward but didn't flee. Instead, she called out softly toward the cabin in her own language. Within moments, the other 2 women appeared in the doorway. The oldest one immediately positioned herself protectively in front of the younger one, while the middle-aged woman moved to the side, her hand reaching for something Thomas couldn't see. The 4 of them stood in silence for what felt like an eternity. Thomas realized that this moment would determine everything that followed. These women had been living on his land, but they were also human beings who deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. Whatever decision he made now would have consequences that would reach far beyond this single evening. The oldest woman finally spoke, her English heavily accented but clear. "You are new owner?" she asked, her voice steady despite the obvious tension of the situation. Thomas nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am. I bought this property in Tucson 2 days ago. I didn't know anyone was living here." The woman studied his face carefully, as if trying to gauge his intentions. "We have nowhere else to go," she said simply. "My husband was killed by soldiers 6 moons ago. My daughter's husband died of fever. Her sister has no husband, no family. We came here when the cold time started because the cabin was empty and we needed shelter." The honesty of her words hit Thomas like a physical blow. These weren't raiders or troublemakers. They were refugees, women who had lost their men and were simply trying to survive in a world that had become increasingly hostile to their people. Thomas lowered his rifle completely and took a step forward. "What are your names?" he asked. The oldest woman hesitated for a moment, then replied. "I am Maria, named by the Mexican priest who baptized me as a child. This is my daughter Elena, and her sister Sophia. We have been living here since the winter, growing food, keeping the cabin clean. We thought no one would come." Thomas introduced himself and explained how he had come to own the property. As he spoke, he could see the despair growing in the women's eyes. They had found a place of safety, and now it was being taken away from them again. "Where will you go?" he asked, though he dreaded hearing the answer. Maria's shoulders sagged slightly. "The reservation is many days' walk. We have no horses, no money to buy food for the journey. And, even there..." She trailed off, but Thomas understood. Life on the reservations was hard, and 3 women alone would have little protection or support. The sun had set completely now, and stars were beginning to appear in the clear Arizona sky. Thomas looked at his new property, at the cabin that was supposed to be his fresh start, and at the 3 women who had nowhere else to go. In that moment, he made a decision that surprised even himself. "You can stay," he said quietly. The 3 women looked at him in shock, as if they couldn't believe what they had heard. "At least for now," Thomas continued, working out the details as he spoke. "The cabin's big enough for all of us if we're respectful of each other. You know this land better than I do, and I could use the help getting started. In exchange, you'll have a place to live and food to eat." Maria studied his face intently. "Why would you do this?" she asked. "We are Apache. Your people and mine have fought for many years." Thomas thought about her question for a long moment before answering. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because maybe it's time for the fighting to stop, at least in this one small place." The relief on the women's faces was unmistakable, though they tried to hide it behind masks of stoic dignity. Elena, the middle daughter, stepped forward and spoke for the first time. "We will earn our keep," she said in English that was better than her mother's. "We know how to grow food, how to preserve meat, how to read the weather and the signs of the land. We will not be burdened to you." Thomas nodded, feeling a strange mixture of nervousness and excitement about what he had just committed himself to. "I reckon we'll figure it out as we go," he said. "Right now, I'm hungry and tired, and I imagine you are too. How about we share some supper and talk about how this is going to work?" The women exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, Maria nodded. "Come," she said, gesturing toward the cabin. "We have stew and bread. You are welcome at our fire." As Thomas followed the 3 Apache women into the cabin that was legally his but had become theirs through necessity, he wondered what he had gotten himself into. The arrangement he had just proposed would be challenging at best, dangerous at worst. If word got out that he was harboring Apache women on his property, it could bring trouble from both the territorial authorities and his future neighbors. But, as he sat down by the fire and accepted a bowl of rabbit stew from Sophia, the youngest of the 3, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the sense that he was home. Not just because he finally owned land, but because he was sharing it with people who needed it as much as he did. The 4 of them ate in relative silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what the future might hold. Outside, the night sounds of the Arizona wilderness surrounded the cabin like a protective blanket. Coyotes howled in the distance, and an owl called from the oak trees along the creek. Thomas realized that his $50 investment had bought him more than just 800 acres of land. It had bought him a chance to build something entirely new, something that might bridge the gap between 2 worlds that had been at war for too long. Whether that something would survive and prosper remained to be seen, but, for the first time in his adult life, Thomas McKenna felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The first light of dawn was filtering through the cabin windows when Thomas woke up. He had spent the night on a bedroll near the fireplace, while the 3 Apache women had retreated to what had clearly been their sleeping area in the back corner of the single-room cabin. The arrangement felt awkward and uncertain, like everyone was walking on eggshells, unsure of what the new day would bring. Thomas quietly pulled on his boots and stepped outside into the cool morning air. The valley looked even more beautiful in the early light, with mist rising from the creek and the surrounding hills painted in soft shades of gold and purple. He had made the right decision in buying this land, though he was still unsure about his impulsive decision to share it. He was examining the remains of the old corrals when Maria emerged from the cabin, carrying a bucket toward the creek. She paused when she saw him, then approached slowly. "You did not change your mind in the night?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Thomas turned to face her. "No, ma'am. A man's word ought to mean something, and I gave you my word." He gestured toward the broken fence posts and sagging rails. "I was just looking at what needs to be fixed around here. Looks like Morrison left the place in decent shape, but it's been sitting empty for 2 years." Maria nodded. "We have tried to care for it, but some things require a man's strength." She set down her bucket and walked over to examine the corrals with him. The winter storms damaged much of the fencing. And there, she pointed toward a section where several posts had fallen completely. Something heavy broke through. Maybe a bear, or perhaps wild horses. Thomas could see that the women had indeed been taking care of the property as best they could. The cabin was clean and well maintained, the area around it was clear of brush and debris, and he had noticed that someone had even been maintaining a small garden plot behind the house. "Tell me about the land," he said. "You've been here through the winter and spring." "What do I need to know?" For the next hour, Maria showed him around the property, pointing out the best grazing areas, explaining the seasonal patterns of the creek, and describing which areas were most sheltered from winter storms. Her knowledge was extensive and practical, the kind of information that would take him years to learn on his own. Elena and Sophia emerged from the cabin as the sun climbed higher, and soon all 4 of them were working together to assess what needed to be done. Sophia, despite being the youngest, proved to have an excellent eye for detail and noticed several small problems that the others had missed. "The roof over the barn needs repair before the summer rains," she observed, pointing to a section where some shingles had blown away. "And someone should check the well. The water tastes different than it did a month ago." Elena, meanwhile, was focused on more immediate concerns. "We need to decide about food," she said practically. "Our supplies are low, and we have been eating mostly what we could hunt and gather. If there are 4 of us now, we will need more." Thomas realized he hadn't thought through the practical aspects of his decision. His own supplies were minimal, barely enough to last a week. He had been planning to live simply while he got the ranch established, but feeding 4 people would require more planning and resources. "I have about $10 left," he admitted. "It's not much, but maybe enough for basic supplies if we're careful." "Money is not the only way to get what we need," Maria said thoughtfully. "There is a trading post about a day's ride from here, run by a man named Hendricks. He is fair in his dealings and does not ask too many questions about people's circumstances. We have traded with him before." "What did you trade?" Thomas asked, curious. Elena answered. "Hides, mostly. And sometimes herbs that white people use for medicine but do not know how to find. Sophia is very good at finding healing plants." The youngest woman blushed at the praise but nodded. "My grandmother taught me before she died. The land provides everything we need if we know where to look and how to ask properly." Thomas was beginning to understand that his new companions brought skills and knowledge that could be invaluable to establishing a successful ranch. But he was also aware that their presence could create complications he hadn't fully considered. "What about other people?" he asked. "Neighbors, folks in town. How do I explain 3 Apache women living on my ranch?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. All 3 women understood the implications. Anti-Apache sentiment was strong throughout Arizona territory, and many white settlers would view Thomas's arrangement as anything from foolishly naive to outright treasonous. "You could say we work for you," Elena suggested. "It would not be a lie. We will work hard to earn our place here." Maria shook her head. "It is more complicated than that. There are laws about Apache people living off the reservation. We could bring trouble for Thomas, even if he wants to help us." Thomas had heard about such laws but had never paid much attention to them. Now he realized he needed to understand exactly what legal risks he might be taking. "What kind of trouble?" he asked. "Officials could come and force us to leave for the reservation," Maria explained. Or they could arrest Thomas for harboring Indians without proper permits. The territorial government is very serious about controlling where Apache people live. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. All four of them froze, listening carefully to the hoofbeats echoing off the valley walls. Thomas counted at least 3 horses, maybe 4, moving at a steady pace that suggested they were heading directly for the cabin. "Hide," Thomas said quickly to the women. "Get into the cabin and stay out of sight until we know who it is." But Maria shook her head. "If they are looking for us, hiding will only make things worse. Better to face whatever comes." The riders appeared at the crest of the ridge above the valley, silhouetted against the morning sky. Thomas could make out 3 men on horseback, and, even at a distance, something about their purposeful approach suggested they weren't casual visitors. As the men rode down into the valley, Thomas could see more details. They wore the mixed civilian and military clothing typical of territorial law enforcement, and each carried a rifle prominently displayed across his saddle. The leader was a tall, thin man with a graying beard, while his 2 companions appeared younger and harder looking. "That's Marshal Garrett," Elena said quietly, her voice tight with worry. "He came to the reservation several times when we lived there. He is not a cruel man, but he follows the law exactly." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. He had been a landowner for exactly 3 days, and already he was facing a confrontation with territorial law enforcement. The 3 riders approached the cabin at a walking pace, giving Thomas time to think through his options. He could claim ignorance about the women's presence, or he could lie and say they were just passing through. But something about Maria's dignity and Elena's courage made him reluctant to deny their right to be there. Marshal Garrett reined in his horse about 20 feet from the cabin and touched the brim of his hat politely. "Morning," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his office but without open hostility. "I'm Marshal Garrett, Territorial Law Enforcement. This is Deputy Williams and Deputy Santos. We're looking for 3 Apache women who left the San Carlos Reservation without authorization about 6 months ago." Thomas stepped forward, acutely aware that his decision in the next few moments could determine the fate of all 4 of them. "I'm Thomas McKenna," he said. "I just bought this property a few days ago." The marshal's eyes flicked over the 3 women standing behind Thomas, then back to his face. "And these ladies would be?" Thomas felt the weight of the moment. He could still lie, still claim they were just travelers he had encountered. But, as he looked at Maria's proud bearing and the quiet dignity with which all 3 women faced this confrontation, he found he couldn't do it. "They're living here," he said simply. "They've been taking care of the property, and I've asked them to stay on and help me get the ranch established." Deputy Williams, a younger man with angry eyes, spoke up sharply. "You can't just decide to keep reservation Indians on private property without proper authorization. There are laws about this." Marshal Garrett raised a hand to quiet his deputy, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. "That's true, Mr. McKenna. Federal law requires Apache people to remain on designated reservations unless they have specific permission to leave. The penalties for harboring unauthorized Indians can include hefty fines and even jail time." Thomas felt his mouth go dry, but he forced himself to meet the marshal's gaze steadily. "What if I were to seek proper authorization?" "For that, you'd need to petition the Territorial Governor's Office and the Bureau of Indian Affairs," Garrett replied. "It's a complicated process that can take months, and approval is far from guaranteed. Most such requests are denied." Sophia suddenly stepped forward, speaking for the first time since the marshals had arrived. "Marshal Garrett," she said, her young voice clear and steady, "you remember me from the reservation. You know we are not troublemakers. We have hurt no one, stolen nothing. We only wish to live in peace." Garrett's expression softened slightly as he looked at the young woman. "I do remember you, Sophia. And, you're right, none of you have caused trouble. But, the law is the law, regardless of personal circumstances. What law says 3 women cannot live where they choose to live?" Maria asked, stepping up beside her youngest daughter. "What law says a man cannot invite neighbors to share his home?" Deputy Santos, who had been silent until now, laughed harshly. "Apache law, maybe. But, this is United States territory now, and U.S. law says Indians live where the government tells them to live. The contempt in the deputy's voice triggered something in Thomas that he hadn't felt since his younger, more hot-headed days. "Seems to me," he said, his voice carrying a new edge, "that if I own this land legally, I ought to have some say in who lives on it." Marshal Garrett studied Thomas carefully. "You're new to the territory, Mr. McKenna. You may not understand the complexities of the situation here. The Apache Wars ended only a few years ago, and feelings still run high on both sides. There are people who would see your arrangement as a betrayal of everything the territory has fought for. And there are people who might see it as a step toward something better," Thomas replied. "These women aren't warriors or raiders. They're just trying to survive." The marshal dismounted and walked closer, his tone becoming more conversational. "I don't disagree with you, personally. But I have a job to do, and that job is to enforce federal law. Now, I could arrest all four of you right now and let the territorial courts sort it out. But that would be hard on everyone involved, especially the women." Thomas felt a glimmer of hope. The marshal seemed to be suggesting there might be alternatives. "What do you propose?" Thomas asked. Garrett thought for a moment, glancing at his deputies and, then, back at the four people standing before him. "Here's what I can do," he said finally. "I'm going to file a report that says I investigated reports of unauthorized Apache presence in this area and found the reports to be unsubstantiated. But," he held up a warning finger, "this arrangement needs to become legal as quickly as possible. You start the paperwork process immediately, and these women keep a very low profile until it's resolved." Deputy Williams started to object, but Garrett cut him off with a sharp look. "Furthermore," the marshal continued, "if there are any complaints from neighbors, any trouble of any kind, I'll have no choice but to come back and enforce the letter of the law." "Understood?" Thomas nodded gratefully. "Understood. And, thank you, Marshal. You won't regret this." Garrett remounted his horse, then looked down at the three Apache women. "Ladies," he said, touching his hat again, "I hope this works out for all of you. But please understand that you're walking a narrow line here. Stay out of sight when possible, and don't give anyone a reason to make trouble." As the three lawmen rode away, Thomas felt both relief and the weight of new responsibility. He had bought himself time, but the underlying problems hadn't been solved. He needed to navigate a complex legal process while keeping three Apache women safe in a territory where anti-Indian sentiment ran deep. Elena must have been thinking similar thoughts. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Not many white men would have taken such a risk for people they barely know." Thomas looked at her, surprised by the emotion in her voice. "Seems to me you would have done the same thing if the situations were reversed." Sophia laughed, a sound like silver bells that seemed to lighten the heavy mood left by the marshal's visit. "Now we are truly committed to making this work," she said. "We cannot fail, because failure means separation and, possibly jail for all of us." Maria nodded soberly. "The girl is right. This is no longer just about finding a place to live. We are all bound together now, for better or worse." Thomas looked around at his new partners in what was beginning to feel less like a ranch and more like an experiment in creating a new kind of community. The challenges ahead were daunting, but, for the first time since arriving in Arizona territory, he felt like he was part of something larger than himself. "Well then," he said, rolling up his sleeves, "I reckon we'd better get to work making this the best ranch in Arizona territory. Because if we're going to break new ground, we might as well do it right." The rest of the morning was spent making plans. They would need to repair the corrals and fencing, establish a larger garden to feed 4 people, and begin the process of acquiring cattle to make the ranch profitable. But, more immediately, they needed to establish routines and boundaries that would allow 4 very different people to live and work together successfully. As they talked and planned, Thomas began to see his 3 companions more clearly as individuals rather than simply Apache women. Maria proved to have a sharp mind for business and logistics, understanding instinctively how to balance immediate needs against long-term goals. Elena combined practical skills with an uncompromising honesty that reminded Thomas of his own approach to life. And Sophia, despite her youth, had a way of seeing solutions that escaped the others, approaching problems from unexpected angles. By midday, they had outlined a division of labor that played to each person's strengths. Thomas would handle the heavy construction work and anything that required dealing with the outside world. Maria would manage the household and plan their food production. Elena would focus on the livestock aspects of the operation, drawing on knowledge gained from years of living close to the land. And Sophia would handle the garden and continue gathering wild foods and medicines that could be traded for supplies they couldn't produce themselves. It was an ambitious plan, but as Thomas looked around at his new partners, he felt a growing confidence that they could make it work. The legal challenges remained, and the social acceptance would be even harder to achieve, but they had something that many failed ranches lacked: a shared commitment to success and the diverse skills needed to achieve it. The afternoon brought their first test of the new arrangement. While working on repairing a section of fence, Thomas noticed a group of riders approaching from the south. Unlike the marshal's official visit, these men had the look of local ranchers, and their approach was less formal but potentially more dangerous. "Company coming," he called out to the others. Elena shaded her eyes against the sun. "I know those men," she said grimly. "They have a ranch about 10 miles south of here." They were among those who demanded that all Apache be sent to reservations, with no exceptions. Thomas felt his heart sink. The marshal's warning about avoiding trouble suddenly seemed much more urgent. Whatever happened in the next few minutes could determine whether his brave experiment would survive its first week. The three riders approaching from the south moved with the casual confidence of men who considered themselves the rightful owners of everything they could see. Thomas recognized the type immediately: established ranchers who had been in the territory long enough to feel entitled to have opinions about how everyone else should live their lives. The leader was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a carefully maintained mustache and clothes that spoke of prosperity. His companions were younger, probably his sons or hired hands, and both wore their guns with the easy familiarity of men who had used them before. "That's Connor Bradshaw," Elena said quietly, moving closer to Thomas. "He owns about 3,000 acres south of here, runs maybe 200 head of cattle. He's been trying to convince the territorial government to clear all Apache people out of this part of the territory for the past 5 years." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. He had hoped for more time to establish his position before facing this kind of confrontation, but life rarely accommodated such hopes. "What should we do?" Sophia asked, her young voice betraying her nervousness. "We stand our ground," Thomas replied firmly. "This is my land, legally purchased, and you're my guests. Nobody has a right to tell us otherwise." Maria placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Be careful, Thomas. Men like Bradshaw have power and influence. They can make life very difficult for people who oppose them." The riders pulled up about 20 feet away, close enough for conversation but far enough to demonstrate that they considered themselves superior to the people they were visiting. Bradshaw's eyes swept over the three Apache women before settling on Thomas with undisguised contempt. "You must be McKenna," Bradshaw said, not bothering to dismount. "Word travels fast in this territory. I hear you've taken it upon yourself to set up some kind of Apache refuge on your property." Thomas stepped forward, making sure he was positioned between Bradshaw and the women. "I've invited some neighbors to help me work my ranch," he replied evenly. "Don't see how that's anybody's business but mine." One of the younger men, who bore a strong resemblance to Bradshaw, laughed harshly. "Neighbors? These are Apache squaws, McKenna. They belong on the reservation with the rest of their kind, not running free in civilized territory." The words hit Thomas like a slap, and he felt his temper rising. But before he could respond, Elena stepped up beside him. "I am Elena Delgado," she said, her English clear and precise. "My husband fought alongside American soldiers against Geronimo's raiders until he died of fever 2 years ago. My mother, Maria, was married to a Mexican citizen and baptized in the Catholic Church. My sister Sophia has never raised a hand in violence against anyone. What, exactly, makes us unsuitable neighbors?" Bradshaw's mustache twitched with irritation at being addressed directly by an Apache woman. "The fact that you're Apache makes you unsuitable," he said bluntly. "This territory was pacified at great cost in blood and money, and we didn't go through that hell just to have Indians move back in whenever they please." Thomas could feel the situation escalating beyond reason, and he knew that anything he said now would likely be taken as a declaration of war against the established ranching community. But he also knew that backing down would mean abandoning 3 people who had come to depend on him for protection. "Mr. Bradshaw," he said, working to keep his voice calm and reasonable, "these women aren't raiders or troublemakers. They're trying to build peaceful lives, just like everyone else. Surely there's room in this territory for people of goodwill to coexist." The older rancher's eyes narrowed. "That's a fine sentiment, McKenna, but it shows you don't understand the realities of this place. We've got a delicate peace here, and it depends on everyone staying where they belong. When Apaches start living off the reservation, it gives other Indians ideas about ignoring federal law." "What it gives other Indians," Maria said, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began, "is hope that someday they might be judged by their actions rather than their blood." The second of Bradshaw's companions, a young man with cruel eyes and a badly scarred face, spat into the dirt. "Pretty words don't change what you are," he said. "Apache killed my brother during the raids 5 years ago. Far as I'm concerned, the only good Indian is one that's locked up tight on the reservation." Sophia flinched at the venom in his voice, and Thomas felt something cold and dangerous stir in his chest. He had faced down angry bulls and drunken cowboys, but this kind of casual hatred was something different, something that threatened the very foundation of what he was trying to build. "I'm sorry for your loss," Thomas said to the scarred man, "but these women had nothing to do with your brother's death. Holding them responsible for crimes they didn't commit isn't justice, it's just revenge." Bradshaw shifted in his saddle, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "Let me make something clear, McKenna. This territory has rules, written and unwritten. You can pretend those rules don't apply to you, but that doesn't make it true. There will be consequences for this foolishness." "What kind of consequences?" Thomas asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "The kind that happen when people refuse to listen to friendly advice," Bradshaw replied ominously. "You're new here, so maybe you don't understand how things work. But this territory is full of dangers: Apache raids, cattle rustlers, wolves, accidents. A man living alone with 3 Indian women might find himself facing any number of unfortunate situations." The threat was clear, even though it was couched in reasonable language. Thomas felt his hand drift toward his rifle, but Elena's sharp intake of breath reminded him that violence would only prove Bradshaw's point about the danger of allowing Apache people to live freely. "I appreciate your concern for my safety," Thomas said with heavy sarcasm, "but I reckon I can take care of myself and my friends." Bradshaw's son spoke up again. "Friends? Is that what you call them? Because word around the territory is that you're doing more than just sharing meals with these squaws." The insult hung in the air like a thunderclap. Thomas felt his vision narrow to a red tunnel, and his hand actually touched his rifle before Maria's voice cut through his rage. "We do not need you to defend our honor with violence," she said firmly. "Men who speak such words reveal more about themselves than about us." Her dignity in the face of such crude provocation helped Thomas regain control of his temper. He forced his hand away from his weapon and took a deep breath. "I think this conversation has run its course," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "You gentlemen are welcome to visit again when you have something constructive to say." Bradshaw's eyes glittered with satisfaction, as if Thomas's restraint confirmed his suspicions about the man's character. "We'll be watching, McKenna," he said. "And when your little experiment collapses, we'll be here to help pick up the pieces." The 3 riders wheeled their horses around and rode away at a gallop, leaving a cloud of dust and the echo of implied threats hanging over the valley. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Thomas stared after the departing riders, his mind racing through the implications of what had just happened. He had made enemies of his closest neighbors, and those enemies clearly had both the will and the power to cause serious trouble. "I'm sorry," Elena said quietly. "This is exactly what we hoped to avoid. Our presence here is going to bring you nothing but trouble." Thomas turned to look at her, surprised by the pain in her voice. "This isn't your fault," he said firmly. "Men like Bradshaw would find a reason to cause trouble no matter what. At least this way, we know where we stand." Sophia, who had been silent during the confrontation, finally spoke up. "What do we do now? If they try to make trouble for us, who will believe our side of the story?" It was a good question, and Thomas didn't have a ready answer. In a territory where anti-Apache sentiment ran deep, they would be fighting an uphill battle to win acceptance from the community. "We proved them wrong," Maria said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her daughters. "We work harder than anyone else, we cause no trouble, and we show by our actions that people of different backgrounds can live together in peace." "And if that's not enough?" Elena asked. "Then, we'll deal with whatever comes," Thomas replied. "But I'll be damned if I'm going to let fear dictate how I live my life." The afternoon following Bradshaw's visit was spent in tense preparation. Thomas checked and cleaned his rifle, while the women discussed emergency plans in case of trouble. It was clear that all of them understood the seriousness of their situation, but equally clear that none of them were prepared to give up without a fight. As evening approached, Sophia made a suggestion that surprised everyone. "We should invite them back," she said. "What?" Elena stared at her sister in disbelief. "Why would we want those men to return?" "Not for fighting," Sophia explained patiently. "For talking. Real talking, where we try to understand each other instead of just trading threats." Thomas shook his head. "Sophia, those men aren't interested in understanding anything. They've already made up their minds about us." "Have they?" the young woman asked. "Or have they just never had a chance to see us as real people instead of symbols of their fears?" Maria looked at her youngest daughter with something approaching admiration. "It is a generous idea," she said slowly, "but also a dangerous one. What if they see an invitation as a sign of weakness? What if they see it as a sign of strength?" Sophia countered. "What if we surprise them by refusing to be the enemies they expect us to be?" The conversation continued late into the evening, with all four of them wrestling with the question of how to respond to the hostility they faced. Thomas found himself torn between his natural instinct to fight back and his growing respect for Sophia's wisdom. The girl had a way of seeing past the surface anger to the fears that lay beneath, and her suggestion, while risky, offered a potential path toward something better than endless conflict. Over the next several days, life at the ranch settled into a routine that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. Thomas worked on repairing the corrals and outbuildings, while the women tended the expanded garden and maintained the cabin. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and share stories about their past lives, gradually building the trust and understanding that their unusual partnership required. Thomas learned that Maria had been educated by Catholic missionaries and could read and write in both Spanish and English. Elena had spent time working as a translator for the territorial government before the increasing hostility toward Apache people made such employment impossible. And Sophia, despite her youth, had absorbed an encyclopedic knowledge of local plants and their uses from her grandmother, knowledge that was already proving invaluable in their efforts to become self-sufficient. The women, in turn, learned about Thomas's background as the youngest son of a failed farmer in Kansas, his decision to come west after his father lost the family land to debt, and his determination to build something permanent and meaningful with his own hands. On the fourth day after Bradshaw's visit, their tentative peace was shattered by the arrival of a lone rider approaching at full gallop from the direction of town. As the man drew closer, Thomas could see that he was young, perhaps 25, and that his horse was lathered with sweat from hard riding. The rider pulled up short and dismounted quickly, his eyes wide with urgency. "Are you McKenna?" he asked breathlessly. "Yes, I'm McKenna." "What's the emergency?" The young man glanced nervously at the three Apache women before answering. "There's been trouble in town. Someone attacked the stagecoach yesterday about 10 miles from here. The driver was killed, and a passenger was wounded. There's talk that it might have been Apache raiders." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that's got people organizing posses and talking about cleaning out every Indian they can find, reservation or no reservation," the writer replied grimly. "Word is that Connor Bradshaw is leading one group, and they're planning to start searching every ranch and cabin in the territory." Elena stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "Did anyone actually see Apache raiders, or are people just assuming?" The young man shrugged. "From what I heard, nobody got a clear look at the attackers. Could have been anyone, Apache, Mexican bandits, maybe even white men disguised as Indians. But, you know how people get when there's blood spilled. They want someone to blame." Thomas understood the implications immediately. Whether the attackers had actually been Apache or not, his three companions would be assumed guilty by association. And, with tensions already high from their confrontation with Bradshaw, their ranch would likely be among the first places searched. "How much time do we have?" he asked. "Maybe a few hours, maybe less," the writer replied. "Bradshaw was gathering men when I left town, and he seemed mighty eager to get started." Sophia spoke up quietly. "We should leave now, while we still can. If they find us here, they won't stop to ask questions about our innocence." But Maria shook her head firmly. "Running now will only convince them that we are guilty." "And where would we go? The reservation is too far, and we would be caught long before we reached safety." Thomas looked at each of his companions, seeing the fear in their eyes but also the courage that had carried them through years of hardship and loss. In that moment, he realized that the decision he was about to make would define not only their immediate future, but the kind of man he was going to be for the rest of his life. "We're not running," he said firmly. "This is our home, legally and morally, and we have nothing to hide. If Bradshaw wants to search this place, he can do it properly, with proper authority, and we'll cooperate fully." Elena looked at him with a mixture of admiration and terror. "Thomas, these men are not interested in legal procedures. They want blood, and they're not particular about whose blood they spill." "Then, it's time someone stood up to them," Thomas replied. "If we run now, they'll just hunt down the next innocent people they can find. This has to stop somewhere, and it might as well stop here." The young writer shook his head in disbelief. "You're making a mistake, McKenna. These men are serious, and they outnumber you by a lot. You can't fight a whole posse with just one rifle." "Who says I'll be fighting alone?" Thomas asked, looking meaningfully at his three companions. The writer's eyes widened as he realized the implications. "You can't be serious. You're going to arm Apache women? Do you have any idea what that will look like to people in town?" Thomas smiled grimly. "It'll look like 4 Americans defending their home against an illegal mob. And if that's not enough to stop them, then this territory isn't worth saving anyway." As the young man rode away, shaking his head at what he clearly considered a suicidal decision, Thomas and the 3 women began preparing for what could be the fight of their lives. But, for the first time since arriving in Arizona territory, Thomas felt like he was exactly where he belonged, fighting for something that truly mattered. The sound of approaching horses reached them long before the riders came into view, echoing off the valley walls like distant thunder. Thomas had positioned himself on the cabin's front porch with his Henry rifle across his knees, while Maria, Elena, and Sophia waited inside, each armed with weapons Thomas had reluctantly provided from Morrison's old gun cabinet. As the posse crested the ridge overlooking the valley, Thomas counted 12 men, more than he had expected. Bradshaw rode at their head, and, even at a distance, Thomas could see the grim determination on the faces of the men behind him. These weren't just neighbors concerned about safety, they were a mob seeking vengeance, and they had convinced themselves that vengeance and justice were the same thing. The riders approached slowly, spreading out in a semicircle as they reached the flat ground near the cabin. It was a tactical formation designed to prevent anyone from escaping, and Thomas felt his mouth go dry as he realized how serious these men were about their mission. Bradshaw dismounted and walked forward alone, his hand resting on his pistol grip. "McKenna," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "We're here to search your property for Apache raiders. Stand aside and let us do what needs to be done." Thomas remained seated, his rifle held casually but ready. "You have a search warrant, Bradshaw? Some kind of legal authority for what you're doing?" "Don't need a warrant to pursue murderers," one of the other men called out. "Apache raiders killed Tom Henderson and wounded his passenger yesterday. We're going to find them, and we're going to make them pay." "And what makes you think they're here?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. Bradshaw's son, the same young man who had been part of the previous confrontation, spoke up with obvious satisfaction. "Because you're harboring 3 Apache women, and everyone knows they must be in contact with the raiders. Indians stick together when it comes to killing whites." The casual racism of the statement hit Thomas like a physical blow, but he forced himself to remain calm. "That's quite an assumption," he said. "Got any evidence to back it up?" The evidence is that you've got Apache living on your ranch instead of on the reservation where they belong, Bradshaw replied. That's evidence enough for any reasonable person. Thomas stood up slowly, keeping his rifle pointed toward the ground but ready to use. Then, I guess we disagree about what constitutes reasonable. The tension in the air was palpable, like the heavy stillness before a thunderstorm. Thomas could feel 12 pairs of eyes watching his every movement, looking for any excuse to escalate the situation into violence. Behind him, he could sense the 3 women waiting inside the cabin, probably terrified but determined to stand with him regardless of the consequences. Marshal Garrett's voice cut through the tension like a knife. That's far enough, gentlemen. Every head turned toward the ridge, where the territorial marshal sat his horse flanked by 2 deputies. Garrett looked tired and irritated, as if he had been dealing with this kind of vigilante nonsense all morning. Marshal, Bradshaw called out, his tone suddenly more respectful. We're pursuing the Apache raiders who attacked the stagecoach. We have reliable information that they might be hiding here. Garrett rode down into the valley at a leisurely pace, his eyes taking in the armed confrontation below. When he reached the group, he dismounted and walked over to stand between Bradshaw and Thomas. What kind of reliable information? Garrett asked. Bradshaw's confidence seemed to waver slightly under the marshal's steady gaze. Well, McKenna here has been harboring Apache women on his property. Stands to reason they might be connected to the raiders. Stands to reason, does it? Garrett's voice carried a note of skepticism. Based on what, exactly? The fact that they happen to be Apache? The scarred young man who had lost his brother spoke up angrily. That's enough reason for me, Marshal. These Indians are all the same, they pretend to be peaceful until they get a chance to murder innocent folks. Garrett turned his full attention to the speaker, and Thomas could see the marshal's patience wearing thin. What's your name, son? Billy Morrison, the young man replied, his chin raised defiantly. Well, Billy Morrison, Garrett said slowly, I've been investigating that stagecoach attack since dawn this morning, and I've found some interesting evidence. Would you like to know what I discovered? The question hung in the air, and Thomas could see uncertainty beginning to creep into the faces of some of the posse members. Go on, Bradshaw said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier authority. Garrett reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a distinctive piece of cloth. Found this caught on a mesquite bush near the attack site. Recognize it? Thomas squinted at the fabric, which appeared to be torn from a shirt or jacket. Several of the posse members shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. It's from a white man's shirt, Garrett continued. Good quality cloth, the kind worn by someone with money. Not the sort of thing you'd find on an Apache raider. Billy Morrison's face flushed red. Could have been taken from a previous victim, he protested. Could have been, Garrett agreed. But there's more. Found horse tracks too, shod horses. Apache raiders don't usually shoe their ponies, Billy. They prefer them barefoot for better traction on rocky ground. The implications of Garrett's discoveries were starting to sink in among the posse members. Thomas could see doubt replacing certainty on several faces, though Bradshaw and his core supporters still looked determined to proceed. Even if the stagecoach wasn't attacked by Apache, Bradshaw said stubbornly, that doesn't change the fact that McKenna is illegally harboring reservation Indians. Garrett nodded slowly. That's true. But harboring Indians is a federal matter, not something for local posses to handle. If you've got complaints about Mr. McKenna's arrangements, you file them through proper channels. And, in the meantime, these women continue to live free while good white folks worry about their safety? Morrison demanded. For the first time since the confrontation began, the cabin door opened and Elena stepped outside. She moved with quiet dignity to stand beside Thomas, her dark eyes surveying the group of armed men without flinching. My name is Elena Delgado, she said, her voice carrying clearly to every member of the posse. My husband, Roberto Delgado, served as a scout for the U.S. Army until his death from fever 2 years ago. He helped track down the last of Geronimo's raiders, and he saved the lives of at least a dozen soldiers during his service. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. My mother, Maria, was married to a Mexican citizen and has lived peacefully among white people for over 20 years. My sister Sophia has never raised her hand in violence against anyone. We are not raiders or criminals. We are simply three women trying to make an honest living. Billy Morrison sneered. Pretty words, but how do we know you're telling the truth? How do we know you haven't been feeding information to raiders or providing them with supplies? Sophia appeared in the doorway, her young face set with determination. Because, she said clearly, I can prove where we were yesterday when the stagecoach was attacked. Every eye turned toward the youngest of the three women as she walked out to join her sister and Thomas. We were at Hendrick's trading post, Sophia continued. Mr. Hendricks will remember us because we traded medicinal herbs for supplies. We arrived in the morning and didn't leave until late afternoon. The trading post is 20 miles from where the attack took place. Garrett looked interested. Can anyone else confirm that? Mrs. Hendricks was there, Sophia replied. And 2 other customers, a Mexican family traveling to Tucson. They can all testify that we were nowhere near the attack site. Thomas could see the foundation of Bradshaw's case crumbling before his eyes. The evidence Garrett had found suggested the attackers weren't Apache, and Sophia had provided what sounded like a solid alibi for the 3 women. But Bradshaw wasn't ready to give up. Even if these 3 weren't directly involved, he said, their presence here encourages other Apache to ignore federal law. It sets a dangerous precedent. What's dangerous, Maria said, emerging from the cabin to stand with her daughters, is assuming that all people of one race are responsible for the crimes of a few. What's dangerous is allowing fear and hatred to replace justice and reason. Her words hit some of the posse members like a physical blow. Thomas could see several men shifting uncomfortably in their saddles, as if they were beginning to question their participation in the confrontation. Marshal Garrett seemed to sense the changing mood. Gentlemen, he said firmly, I think this matter is settled. There's no evidence connecting these women to the stagecoach attack, and they have what appears to be a solid alibi. I suggest you all head back to town and let me continue my investigation through proper channels. Bradshaw's face was red with frustration and embarrassment. This isn't over, McKenna, he said, pointing an accusing finger at Thomas. Mark my words, having Apache living off the reservation will lead to trouble, and, when it does, the blood will be on your hands. The only blood I see here, Thomas replied calmly, is the blood you and your friends were planning to spill based on nothing more than prejudice and assumption. Several of the posse members were already turning their horses around, clearly uncomfortable with how the situation had developed. Within a few minutes, only Bradshaw, his son, and Billy Morrison remained, their faces set with stubborn anger. This isn't justice, Morrison said bitterly. No, Garrett replied quietly, this is justice. Justice is following evidence instead of emotion, and protecting innocent people instead of persecuting them. As the last of the hostile riders disappeared over the ridge, Thomas felt his knees nearly give way from relief. The confrontation that could have ended in bloodshed had instead exposed the weakness of the case against his companions, and he had gained an important ally in Marshal Garrett. Thank you, he said to the marshal. I know you didn't have to take our side in this. Garrett shook his head. I didn't take anyone's side. I just followed the evidence and upheld the law. But, McKenna, his tone became more serious, you need to understand that this isn't over. Bradshaw and his supporters aren't going to give up just because they lost this round. You're still living in violation of federal law, and that makes you vulnerable. Elena stepped forward. Marshal, what would it take to make our presence here legal? Like I told you before, you'd need to petition the territorial governor and the Bureau of Indian Affairs for special permission, Garrett explained. It's a complex process, and most requests are denied. But, given the circumstances here, and the fact that you have a sponsor willing to vouch for you, you might have a chance. Sophia looked puzzled. What kind of circumstances would help our case? Garrett smiled slightly. Well, for one thing, you've clearly been taking good care of this property and helping to develop it productively. That's exactly what the territorial government wants to see, land being improved and made profitable. For another, Mr. McKenna here is a legal landowner with no criminal record and apparently good judgment about character. Maria looked thoughtful. What would we need to do to start this process? First, you'd need to travel to the territorial capital and file the proper paperwork, Garrett explained. Then, you'd need letters of recommendation from respected community members vouching for your character. Finally, you'd need to demonstrate that your continued presence here serves some legitimate purpose beyond just having a place to live. Thomas felt a spark of hope. What kind of legitimate purpose? Education, for instance, Garrett suggested. If you were operating some kind of school or providing other services to the community, that would strengthen your case considerably. Sophia's eyes lit up. I could teach people about medicinal plants, she said excitedly. Many settlers don't know how to identify and use the healing herbs that grow wild here. It's knowledge that could save lives. Elena nodded thoughtfully. And I could teach about livestock management in this climate. Many newcomers to the territory make mistakes that cost them their herds. Maria added, I could provide translation services for Spanish-speaking families trying to deal with territorial bureaucracy. Thomas felt his excitement growing. And I could sponsor all of it as an official educational program attached to my ranch operation. Garrett looked impressed despite himself. That might actually work, he said slowly. A multicultural educational center focused on practical skills needed for success in Arizona Territory. The territorial government likes projects that help settlers adapt to local conditions. Over the next hour, they refined their plan. The ranch would become the McKenna Educational Center, offering practical courses in desert survival, medicinal plant identification, livestock management, and cross-cultural communication. Thomas would serve as the director, while the 3 Apache women would function as instructors and cultural liaisons. It was ambitious, but it addressed real needs in the territory while providing a legitimate reason for Maria, Elena, and Sophia to live off the reservation. More importantly, it offered a model for how people from different backgrounds could work together for mutual benefit. As Marshal Garrett prepared to leave, he paused to offer one final piece of advice. This plan has real potential, he said, but you'll need to move fast. File those papers as soon as possible, and start operating your educational program immediately. The more established you become, the harder it will be for people like Bradshaw to shut you down. After the marshal left, the 4 of them spent the evening planning their new venture. They would need to travel to the territorial capital within the week to file the necessary paperwork, and they would need to begin offering classes as soon as possible to establish legitimacy. But, for the first time since Thomas had arrived at his $50 ranch, he felt like they were building something that could last. The hostility they faced hadn't disappeared, but they had found a way to turn their greatest vulnerability, the presence of Apache women on private land, into their greatest strength. As they sat around the fire that night, planning courses and discussing how to reach potential students, Thomas realized that his impulsive purchase had led him to something far more valuable than he had ever imagined. He had bought 800 acres for $50, but what he had really acquired was the chance to be part of creating a new kind of community, one where people were judged by their actions rather than their ancestry. Sophia broke the comfortable silence with a question that had been on all their minds. Do you think it will work? Do you think people will really accept what we're trying to do here? Thomas looked at each of his companions, Maria with her quiet strength, Elena with her fierce determination, and Sophia with her hopeful wisdom. I think, he said slowly, that we're going to find out just what kind of territory Arizona really wants to be. Elena smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression he had seen on her face since their first meeting. Then, we had better make sure we show them the best possible version. As the fire burned down to glowing embers, Thomas felt a deep sense of contentment settle over him. His $50 investment had grown into something priceless, a home built on mutual respect, a purpose worth fighting for, and the beginning of proof that people from different worlds could indeed build something beautiful together. The challenges ahead were real and significant. They would face legal obstacles, social prejudice, and the ongoing hostility of neighbors who preferred the old ways of thinking about race and community. But they had something their opponents lacked, the unshakable conviction that what they were building was not only possible but necessary. In the distance, a coyote howled, its voice echoing off the canyon walls that surrounded their valley. But, instead of sounding lonely or threatening, tonight it sounded like a song of belonging, a reminder that this wild and beautiful land had room for everyone willing to treat it, and each other, with respect. Thomas McKenna had come to Arizona Territory looking for a chance to own land and build a ranch. What he had found instead was the opportunity to be part of something far more important, the creation of a community that could serve as an example of what America might become when people chose hope over fear, understanding over hatred, and cooperation over conflict. As he settled down for sleep that night, Thomas smiled at the thought of what Pemberton, the land office clerk, might think if he knew how that $50 sale had turned out. The man had sold him 800 acres of remote land with Apache problems. What Thomas had discovered was that the Apache weren't the problem, they were part of the solution, and, together they were building something that could change the future of the territory itself.